going to be talking about the 1920s, another period that I really, really enjoy talking about in U.S. history. And a lot of people do because it's a time where we really get to focus on culture and what was happening within culture. Obviously, we'll talk about politics and what else was going on in the country, but we do get to have a lot of emphasis on culture during this time. So 1920s, obviously having the nickname the Roaring 20s because of how well the economy was doing during the 1920s. So this was a time of great prosperity from 1922 to 1928. You might be wondering, why did the United States become so prosperous during this time? Well, one, you have increased productivity. We've talked about Frederick Winslow Taylor's scientific management and how much that had done. Again, that was still being used across the board and leading to a lot of production, increased production in a lot of different areas. Also, energy technologies during this time. You're going to start to see oil and electricity being used a whole lot more. By 1930, 2/3 of homes had electricity. So again, that is leading to more prosperity for people. Think about how much more you can do having electricity and having lights at night to do things now. Also, government policy. You'd see there'd be large tax cuts, low interest rates, and relaxed regulations. So now Wilson's no longer going to be in the presidency, and you're going to see again, now that you have the progressive president out of there, or a Democrat with progressive ideals, that the economy is going to go to being a little bit more laissez-faire and a little bit more unregulated during this time. Also during this time, you're going to have a big boom with the consumer economy. Like I said, places were using scientific management to create a lot more, and people were consuming a lot more. Electricity now enabled Americans to purchase refrigerators, vacuums, washing machines, radios, automobile. The automobile is going to be a huge one. By 1929, you're going to have 26.5 million automobiles registered, when just 16 years before that, you had only had 1.3 million. And this became a key area of growth within the U.S. economy and fundamentally changed American lives. Think about it. Now you could jump inside of a car or in a car. You could travel to places that you wanted to. You could now live outside of a city if you wanted to as well. And really, it's kind of it's hard to overstate how important the automobile would be to America at this point. You'd also see a lot more advertising during this time as companies try to appeal directly to the consumer, and a lot of times try to appeal to consumers for status and popularity. Again, that's something that ads still do all the time. They might not come straight out and say this, but like, hey, if you want to be cool, you have to use our product. Again, that comes out of that time. Also, buying on credit becomes very, very popular. A lot of people start using credit to purchase more and more things. And whereas credit had been used primarily before for necessities and for things that you bigger purchases, you're going to see during this time that the view towards credit kind of shifts, and it's not necessarily necessities, but hey, I want that, but I can't afford it, so I can go on credit and buy that. So what are problems with the economy in the 1920s? You're going to see that farm problems are going to be huge. After World War I, farmers who had borrowed really, really heavily to expand during the war to help provide for the war effort, they were left with large amount of debt. Also, the new technologies that we talked about were good in that they helped increase production, but that also hurts prices because now that's going to drive down prices because you have a excess of supply. Farmers are never going to really recover from World War I throughout the 1920s, and you're going to see the beginning of, when we talk about the Great Depression, that really starts within the farming industry and how bad things were for farmers in the 1920s. Also, you see labor problems. The union movement would slow, and companies often were insisting on being open shop, open to non-union workers, and began to practice welfare capitalism by offering a variety of benefits. So welfare capitalism is kind of like today, if you go to a job and they give you certain benefits, such as healthcare insurance and days off and that kind of thing. And that's what is going to be an issue for organized labor, because companies start realizing that if they do these sort of things, that workers aren't going to want to unionize because they were treating workers the right way. So that's going to be an issue as well for labor unions, at least. So looking at popular culture, again, on popular culture here, we have a picture of Calvin Coolidge, who would be our 30th president, and his wife, Grace Coolidge, who is pictured there. It's interesting contrasting the two of them because Calvin Coolidge, known to be this very, very quiet and reserved guy, but his wife was very, very bubbly, very, very full of personality, known to be quite the fashionista during her time. In fact, if you go to the Smithsonian, they have a display on the dresses of first ladies, and they actually have 3 dresses of Grace Coolidge there because she was known to be so fashionable during her time. So what I want you to do is check out, there is a short scene here from the original Great Gatsby movie, which of course is set in the 1920s. And just give a look to this clip and let me know or think about how does culture appear from this clip to you? How does it feel like people are living? So a change in culture. So you're going to see that popular culture during this time begins to evolve into an age of modernism. Modernism rejected the conventional ways of viewing and interacting with the world and did a lot of challenging of traditional type views. And this is going to be reflected across the board in culture through art, architecture, literature, music, entertainment, fashion, just everything. You're going to see that people start changing how they view things. I mean, even something as simple as architecture, how you build a building, people start to look at it and say, well, maybe let's do it a different way. Let's use a different style. Again, we already talked about how consumerism flourished so much during this time. And again, The Great Gatsby would come out in 1925. And in a lot of ways, The Great Gatsby is seen to reflect what the 1920s culture was really like here in the United States. So some changes in mass media and communication. You're going to have the radio. The radio becomes very, very popular. Again, this is one of these things that people would be buying during this time. Jazz broadcasts, the jazz age would start during this time. Jazz would become a very, very popular form of music to listen to. And it had traced its origins from African Americans in New Orleans. Again, it had been largely a regional thing. And then once the radio comes along, it goes nationwide. Also, the radio could be another thing to help promote that consumer culture through ads and that kind of stuff that you would hear on the radio. Also, during this time, with that, we talk about African Americans being involved in jazz, but also with that, you're going to have the Harlem Renaissance. 20% of Americans of African Americans in the U.S. would live in the North in the 1920s, with many more choosing to migrate. And the largest of those African American communities was Harlem within New York City, with a population of 200,000 African Americans. Now, Harlem becomes known for its concentration of a lot of African American artists, actors, musicians, etc. Some of the leading ones that you're going to hear of are poets like Langston Hughes and jazz musicians such as Duke Ellington and Louis Armstrong, who helped popularize jazz. But the Harlem Renaissance really was a show of kind of some of the elements of white society accepting more African Americans and being appreciative of these certain skills that they had. Now, again, things were not great between whites and blacks across the country, but this is considered one of those ways that there was seeing a little bit more acceptance of African Americans. Also during this time with this, you would have Marcus Garvey talking about African Americans. He was a Jamaican, and he founded the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, which championed Black pride and nationalism. He also pushed for Black separatism by urging Blacks to return to Africa, saying that they would never be treated right in white countries. With this, he actually did arrange a couple trips for African Americans to be sent back to Africa. Again, of course, this idea by Marcus Garvey would not work, but the whole idea of pushing for Black pride and nationalism would be something picked up within the Black community. And in the 1960s, that would be used to inspire a generation of Black leaders, this idea of Marcus Garvey here. And when you're saying, which we already talked about that. All right, mass media and communication, again, the railroad, entertainment programming, Amos and Andy would be one of the most popular radio shows during this time. You can see the ad there for them. Basically, their show was like a form of blackface. They got on there, and in their voice and inclination, the way that they said things, they acted like an African American. Eventually, that show would be taken over and actually be run by African Americans. But that was a popular program. You'd also have sporting events grow in popularity, such as boxing and baseball. Again, this is going to be the era of Babe Ruth and some of the legends of baseball that if you're a baseball fan, I'm sure that you have heard about. Also, politicians using the radio now as a method of mass communication. Of course, FDR would be the one first to go full scale with this. We'll talk about this more when we get into his presidency through his fireside chats, where he spoke directly to the American people. I think Calvin Coolidge was actually the first president to be on the radio, but politicians quickly realize the importance of the radio and being able to directly talk to your constituents. And also, if you think about it, it's kind of cool for the people during that time because usually you had no interaction with the leaders of the country at all, or a presidential candidate or anything like that. But now you could actually hear from them directly on the radio. Movies, again, would become very, very popular in the 1920s. You'd start with like the silent films and then advance on from that. Later during the Great Depression, people enjoyed movies. It was a way to kind of escape life during that time. So people, again, looking for more entertainment through movies. When you finally get to 1939, we're still in the midst of the Great Depression. You'll see the height of the golden age of Hollywood. Some of these movies, Wizard of Oz, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and Gone with the Wind. Also, newspapers and magazines, which had been around for a long time, they had an important role as well with defining cultural norms, establishing, again, this consumer culture through ads and sparking new fads. I think that is right there, actually, the first issue of Vogue. And you can see the lady there, which we're going to talk about flappers, but looking very flapper-esque. When you're talking about 1920s and 30s fashion, you'll see with the guys, it's very traditional, the whole suit and tie type thing. But women obviously are going to start to change in how they are doing their hair and the length of dresses that they're wearing and that kind of stuff. So when we're looking at literature, architecture, and art, again, I had said that those changed a lot due to modernism. So during this time, you're going to see what is known as the lost generation of writers, and they were called this because they existed during the 1920s and because they were very, very critical of religion. They did not like World War I and said it was something that had been propagated by the moneyed interests in the country, and they had a dislike for modernism or for materialism, which again, doesn't really help them fit in the 1920s when materialism was going crazy. And that would include guys like F. Scott Fitzgerald, who wrote The Great Gatsby, Ernest Hemingway, T.S. Eliot, and others. As far as architecture, you're going to see Art Deco style becomes very, very popular, most notably for skyscrapers. I've included a postcard picture there of the Allied Arts Building in downtown Lynchburg. That is an example of Art Deco style. Also, if you've ever been to New York City, the Empire State Building is an example of Art Deco styling. And then in art, Edward Hopper painting, his paintings were inspired largely by the architecture that he saw in cities. This is a famous picture here he painted of a diner that you've probably seen before. But again, people are kind of challenging these traditional ways of doing things and doing things different. So we talk about challenging traditional things. One of the things that's going to be a challenge is traditional religion during this time. Darwin's theory of evolution, in many states, it was actually illegal to teach human evolution. The first real test you're going to see is going to come out of Tennessee. A teacher, John Scopes, he decides he is going to teach evolution, even though it is against the law there. He would be arrested and jailed for that, and eventually it would go to trial. Trial quickly becomes very much a science versus religion trial. This is going to be the first trial to be broadcast on national radio across the whole country. So a lot of Americans are going to hear this and be very, very invested in it. I kind of think about if you were to compare this to something similar. When I was a kid, you had the O.J. Simpson murder trial that a lot of people followed. That's similar to what the Scopes monkey trial was during this time. Now, eventually, John Scopes, he actually would lose this and be fined, and then it would later be overturned. But again, it showed this growing hostility that you're going to see in the country between the two different sides. Also challenges the traditional roles of women. You'd have, of course, we talked about the 19th Amendment being passed with women's suffrage, but now you're going to have the flappers. And the reason they were known that is because the way that their dresses would flap up and down as they danced. And these would be women that are going to push boundaries in a lot of ways, sexual boundaries, having multiple partners, having short skirts and short hair. Again, very non-traditional compared to things in the past. Again, think about it. We're coming out of like the Victorian era of style, which basically women is covered from the neck all the way to the ground. Publicly drinking and smoking. Again, think about drinking, which was illegal during this time, but also smoking and even driving automobiles, which was considered pretty controversial. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Betty Boop in the cartoon, but she was made as a cartoon to kind of represent that prototypical flapper during the 1920s. And again, I put a couple slides in here. This was early 20th century women's fashion, which again was very, very Victorian in style. And you can see how it'd be a huge shock for people to go from this to this. Again, big shock for people. We might look at it today and go, what's the big deal? But again, to them, it was a very, very big deal. As you can see, there's a lot more skin being shown and just a lot of non-traditional ways of doing things, which is going to be unsettling to people. Another challenge to traditional values is challenging open immigration during this time. Immigrants changed American culture, and a lot of people did not like that. So during this time, you're going to see the rise of the new KKK. So now the new KKK wasn't just focused on African Americans, but also was focused on immigrants, Catholics, Jews, and others. And the KKK grows in a lot of popularity. That popularity will quickly die off due to several things that happened around the country. But you're going to even see the movie The Birth of a Nation, which is a silent film. And that silent film basically glorifies the KKK throughout the whole movie. This movie was actually known to be a favorite of Woodrow Wilson and many people within the country during that time. So a lot of people, again, had these sentiments of being anti-immigrant and these new groups coming into the country. Again, we mentioned the Red Scare before, but again, of this fear that immigrants were coming in and we're going to bring communism and try to topple our government. This picture right here showing you 1925 KKK March on Washington, where you have 25,000 KKK members march down Pennsylvania Avenue in Washington, D.C. So again, this movement towards this and this anti-immigrant movement was nationwide. It wasn't just a Southern thing or a Northern thing. It was a nationwide movement. I'm going to show you I want you to check out this clip here from The Birth of a Nation. And as you watch this clip, I want you to think about how a movie like this that becomes so popular in the country is it going to affect American views of African Americans and the KKK. In a lot of ways, it's going to glorify the KKK, and it's going to really put down African Americans. Now, I do warn you, the scene is quite provocative. I'm showing you this scene for historical purposes, and definitely I don't support the message behind this or anything, but I want you to see what this film looked like and what this would have done in people's minds if they had actually watched the scene, and how it's going to change people's views. And I know we talk a lot about today the impact that media has on people's views. Think about how this movie would affect people's views. Again, we mentioned the Red Scare and Sacco and Vanzetti last time. A lot of people worried about immigrants bringing in these communistic, socialistic, or anarchist ideology. Again, Sacco and Vanzetti being executed, and a lot of people think that they were found guilty just because they were immigrants. Also, you would have prohibition, the 18th Amendment. We have mentioned that before, but that is going to lead to an uptick in crime in the country in some areas, meaning organized criminal activity with smuggling of alcohol that leads to criminal organizations such as Al Capone. You would also have speakeasies. These are establishments that sold illegal alcohol. Oftentimes they were in the back of legitimate businesses and that kind of thing. So prohibition, actually, as a general, some of the areas that it was working to reduce crime in, such as like domestic violence and that, it did work. The area that prohibition did not work is organized crime, because you took something alcohol and made it illegal, and that kind of just opened the door for criminal organizations to step in and still produce it and distribute it all over the country. We're talking about the 1920s. Actually, New London, Virginia, right off 460 there in the old town of New London, you had Lum and Iron Springs Hotel, which was a popular spot for people to go to the 1920s because there were seen to be a lot of healing properties in the springs that are in the area there. So just a local connection there for you. Also, another local connection, again, talking about the rise of organized crime. To our south, you have Franklin County. And in Franklin County, you would have, they estimate 98% of the population of Franklin County was somehow involved in the illegal moonshine and illegal alcohol trade during this time. If you've ever seen the movie Lawless, I put the trailer on there for it, which tells the true story of the Bondurant brothers. And then there is another video there talking to a couple historians that will tell you a little bit about them too. So check that out if you want to. Now, shifting, talking about politics during the 1920s, you're going to see this starts what is called the Republican New Era of Warren G. Harding, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. So you're going to see the end of progressive republicanism. Teddy Roosevelt dies in 1919, which marked the end of the progressive wing of the GOP. Remember, the other progressive president that we really focused on was Woodrow Wilson, and Woodrow Wilson was a Democrat. You're going to see that many people were disillusioned over World War I, and that allowed the return of conservative Republicans. These conservative Republicans did not turn fully to the laissez-faire principles that they would have had in the late 19th century, but they did accept the idea of a limited government, and that with limited government, the government could stabilize businesses and the economy. So we didn't go fully laissez-faire, but definitely the focus was trying to stay out of the economy more. So when we look at Republican policies during the 1920s, you're going to see, again, limited government is a big part of that. They supported businesses. Laissez-faire ideals, again, become popular. Progressive policies lose favor. You'll have the growth of more oligopolies, welfare capitalism, which I have mentioned before, these voluntary employee benefits, and American banks would prosper as a result of World War I and some of the things that were put in the Treaty of Versailles. As far as foreign policy went, you see Americans were very disillusioned after World War I. Americans are not wanting to get pulled into any more foreign wars. So the government would work a lot to promote peace and scale back expenditures on defense through treaties of disarmament. American business interests would be protected around the world in the areas that it needed to be through diplomatic means. But again, people did not want to get involved in another war. You'd also see high U.S. tariffs, which would hurt European recovery. But again, it goes along with that whole idea of America first. Now, one of the big things of this era is that you're going to see that the major focus of especially Calvin Coolidge and Republican presidents is how to cut spending. If you look down the third column there at the budget surplus during this time, absolutely incredible how much that grows, especially during the presidency of Coolidge. He had made that a major focus of his presidency. Here's the election of 1920. Again, you'll see Warren G. Harding win. He defeats James M. Cox, a fierce supporter of the League of Nations and progressivism. Harding, during this time, though, he promotes not heroics, but healing, not nostrums, but normalcy. His presidency would be marked by many scandals, most infamously the Teapot Dome scandal, where the Secretary of Interior, Albert Fall, had accepted bribes for granting oil leased within Teapot Dome, Wyoming. He would pardon and release Eugene V. Debs from prison. We talked about Debs got thrown in prison several times for his actions and for being involved with the socialists. Now, Warren G. Harding, known to be a pretty good guy in and of himself, he kind of got basically the same thing that happened to Ulysses S. Grant. He surrounded himself with not the greatest people. And that caused him a lot of issue. Again, the Teapot Dome scandal and some other scandals that popped up as well. Because of that, he was traveling the country in 1923. He visits San Francisco, and while there, he dies of a heart attack. Again, a lot of people felt this was brought on by the stress of dealing with these scandals. Now, Coolidge would run for, of course, re-election 1924, and he would win when he is sworn in again after Warren G. Harding dies. It's very, very interesting. He'd be sworn in at 2:47 in the morning. His dad was actually like a justice of the peace and had been a politician. His dad would be the one that swore him in. He's sworn in as president, and then he goes back to bed. So Calvin Coolidge, known for his cool personality, high morality, and his quiet and humble demeanor. He believed really, really strongly in a limited and financially responsible government. So he pushed for very, very low taxes across the board and low government spending. He vetoed any acts of the Republican Congress that he felt like would grow the budget. And you're actually going to see a lot of his presidency is spent kind of going back and forth with Congress, the Republican Congress during that time, trying to get them to implement his budget ideals. He would sign the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which condemned war across the world, as well as signing the National Origins Act in 1924, which cut immigration quotas. He himself was not a fan of the National Origin Act, but it was one of those things that he signed and so that the Republicans in Congress would go along with his budget priorities. Coolidge, love this guy, has some good quotes. Along one of them is, if you don't say anything, you won't be called on to repeat it. Again, like I said, he was known to be a very, very quiet guy. And he said, the business of America is business. What is a more Republican principle during this time than that one? The business of America is business. That leads us to the election of 1928. Calvin Coolidge refuses to run because he felt like by serving the end of Harding's term and then serving the term that he was elected for, that was all that he needed to serve. And so Hoover, who had never held an elected position before this, outside of minor positions within the government, it had become very, very popular across the country in several different ways. He would run and he would easily win. Again, he had been the former Secretary of Commerce who had never run for public office. He promised voters prosperity and to banish poverty from the United States. That is quite ironic if you know what happens, because unfortunately for him, he happens to be president when the Great Depression starts. And he's going to serve one term and not be looked at fondly in history because of the Great Depression. So again, 1920s, a time of immense change within the country and where things are changing in a big way. A lot of people are prosperous, but remember we talked about how the farmers in the country were not prosperous during this time. In next class, we'll be jumping in to the Great Depression, because you're going to see a lot of that prosperity, actually most of that prosperity, come to a crashing halt in 1929. I hope you have a fantastic day.